He thought he was buying a servant, but the woman who stepped off that train would change every broken thing he owned, including his heart. The night train screamed through Dust Haven, dragging the desert wind behind it. Elias Turner waited on the platform, expecting a plain woman with calloused hands and quiet eyes, someone to keep his house from falling apart. But when Celeste Ward stepped into the lamplight, everything stopped. She wasn't what he ordered. She was what he'd forgotten to hope for. The wind moved like an old memory across the plains, carrying the taste of rust and the smell of sun-burned sage. It rattled the porch boards of Elias Turner's ranch, where a man sat alone with the weight of silence heavy on his shoulders. 3 years had passed since the fire took his wife and their little boy. The world had turned on, but Dust Haven hadn't changed much. Same dirt, same horizon, same sound of the gate creaking in the wind. Elias had stopped counting the days. He rose with the dawn, fed the horses, mended fences, and waited for night to fall so he could sleep without dreaming. Talking had become a chore, and he'd forgotten what it felt like to laugh. The piano that once stood by the window was now a ruin, its lid warped, its keys charred from the fire. It was the only thing he hadn't thrown out. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, it pressed against the broken frame and made a low hum, like the ghost of a song that refused to die. That afternoon, the Reverend came by on his mule, dust clinging to his hat brim. "You'll have company soon," he said, handing Elias a folded letter. "The woman I wrote about, the one willing to work for her keep, she's on the night train tomorrow. A fine hand with wood and instruments, they say. A quiet sort." Elias didn't look up. "I asked for a housekeeper, not a miracle worker." The Reverend smiled, weary but kind. "Maybe you'll get a bit of both." When the old man rode off, the sound of hooves faded into the wind, leaving Elias with the letter in his palm. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Her name was written neat and clear. Celeste Ward. Below it, a line caught his eye. "I fix what still has sound left in it." He folded the letter again and slipped it into his coat. Fixing things was a fool's hope in this country. Wood split, metal rusted, people broke, and once broken, they stayed that way. Night fell slow. He lit the lamp, sat by the window, and listened to the groan of the house settling in the wind. Somewhere outside, one of the horses stamped its hoof, impatient. He rose to check the barn, anything to keep from hearing the echo of the past. Inside, the animals stirred under the amber light. Elias ran his hand along the flank of his oldest mare, Whisper, whose coat still shimmered beneath layers of dust. "You and me, girl," he murmured. "Too stubborn to die. Too tired to start over." The mare flicked her tail, and the samir boards creaked as the wind pressed against the barn. Elias paused. There it was again. That faint hum. Not from the wind this time, but from inside the house. The piano. He stepped back into the doorway, the chill crawling up his neck. The lamp on the table flickered, and the sound came again, softer than breath. He walked to the piano and brushed the dust from the lid. The burned wood felt rough under his calloused hand. When he pressed a single key, a dull note trembled out. Off-pitch, fragile, but alive. He exhaled slowly. "Still got something left in you, huh?" The lamp flame leaned toward the cracked window, quivering in the draft. Outside, the desert stretched endless and bare, stars flickering like embers above the ridge. He poured himself a cup of coffee gone cold and sat again by the window. Tomorrow, some woman he'd never met would step off a train expecting work, maybe safety, maybe a new start. Elias didn't believe in new starts. But as the night deepened, he found himself staring toward the faint line of the railroad in the distance, wondering, against his will, what kind of person fixed things that were already half burned. He tried to shake it off, but the question followed him into sleep. In his dreams, the wind carried music, notes from a piano that should have been silent, and a woman's voice humming low and sure, as if calling something buried to rise again. When dawn came, Elias woke with the taste of dust on his tongue and the echo of that hum still in his ears. The sun crawled over the horizon, washing the land in bronze. He pulled on his coat, stepped outside, and felt the first stirrings of something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was hope, though he'd long forgotten what that felt like. By evening, he'd cleared the porch, filled the lamp, and hitched the wagon. He told himself it was for form's sake, not anticipation. But when the night train's whistle finally sounded across the plain, Elias Turner was already waiting at the station, hat in hand, his heart beating like the hooves of a horse that sensed a storm approaching. The night train screamed once, long and lonely, before sinking into silence. Its smoke unfurled over Dusthaven like a veil, hiding the stars for a brief, trembling moment. Elias Turner stood by the station's wooden post, hat in hand, the lantern's flame bending in the wind beside him. The platform was near empty, except for a sleeping dog and a telegraph clerk dozing against a crate. When the door of the last car opened, a woman stepped down, her figure outlined in the lamplight like a vision drawn from another life. She was not what he expected. Not by a mile. Her dress was plain but neat, brown wool trimmed with travel dust. A small trunk hung from one hand, a carpenter's satchel from the other. The lamplight struck her face, soft, proud, brown skin gleaming with the sheen of desert air. Her eyes caught his, steady and calm, as though she were taking his measure rather than waiting for his approval. "Mr. Turner?" she asked. Her voice was low, melodic, neither shy nor bold, just certain. He nodded, throat dry. "Ma'am, you're Celeste Ward." "I am." She glanced toward the empty plains beyond the tracks. "Is that where your ranch lies?" 5 miles west, he said. "Dry ground. Long way from anywhere." Celeste smiled faintly. "Long way sounds about right." Elias took her trunk, surprised by how light it was. "That all you got?" "It's enough." The wagon wheels groaned as he lifted it onto the bed. The mare stamped once, snorting steam into the cold air. Celeste climbed up without help. The light from the station faded behind them as they rolled into the open dark. The road stretched flat and silent. The night wind pressed against their coats, bringing the scent of dry sage and smoke from distant homesteads. For a long while, neither spoke. Elias kept his eyes on the road, guiding the mare through sand and shadow. Celeste's gaze wandered across the land, as if reading some hidden language in the shapes of the hills. "You've lived here long?" she asked at last. "All my life." "It feels quiet." "Most days it is." "Good," she said softly. "Quiet suits me." He turned his head, just enough to glimpse her face in the moonlight. There was no fear there. Only stillness, the kind earned from walking through storms. He found himself wondering what her life had been before this moment. What roads had led her here, alone, carrying only a trunk and a satchel of tools. When they reached the ranch, the sky was a dark canvas, pricked with cold stars. Elias helped her down. The house loomed ahead, 2 stories of gray timber, warped by sun and wind. The porch sagged, the windows were dull with dust. Celeste looked at it the way a painter studies a blank canvas, quietly, patiently, with no trace of judgment. Inside, the air smelled of ash and old wood. Elias lit a lamp, its glow spreading across the room like a cautious visitor. The piano sat near the wall, half covered by a canvas sheet. Celeste's eyes went to it immediately. She walked toward it without a word, laid her fingers gently on the lid. The wood groaned. "This piano has stories," she murmured. Elias stiffened. "It's broken. Everything that breaks still remembers its sound." He had no answer for that. The lamp hissed as the oil settled. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Where should I sleep?" He pointed toward the spare room down the hall. "It's not much. It doesn't need to be." She disappeared into the dark, the soft rustle of her skirt fading like a breath. Elias stood alone again in the middle of the room. The lamp cast his shadow across the wall, long and crooked. He looked toward the piano, half expecting it to move under her touch. He poured himself water and sat by the table. Through the open door he could hear her, moving, unpacking quietly. Every sound was deliberate, the click of a latch, the small thump of a trunk set down. There was something unhurried about her, like someone who carried her own time within her. Later, when the lamp burned low, Elias rose to check the barn. The night was cooler now, the air heavy with dew. He walked past the corral and stopped at the fence, staring at the horizon where the train had vanished hours before. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, and that thought frightened him more than he cared to admit. Back inside, he paused outside her door. A thin slice of lamplight cut through the crack, and within it he saw her shadow moving. Slow, rhythmic. Then came a sound he hadn't heard in years, a soft hum. No melody he knew, just a tune shaped by breath. It floated through the hallway like smoke, brushing the walls, filling the air that had been dead too long. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, letting the sound wash through him until it faded into stillness. Then he turned toward his room, feeling the strange ache of something he couldn't name, something stirring where he thought nothing lived anymore. When he lay down, the wind rose again, sweeping over the land, rattling the windows. But the sound that stayed with him wasn't the wind. It was her humming, faint and steady, like the heartbeat of the house returning after a long sleep. And though Elias Turner didn't believe in second chances, that night as the lamp flickered out, he found himself waiting for morning. Morning came pale and windless. The sun rose behind a curtain of dust, staining the world in a copper haze. Elias woke early, as he always did, though something felt off. The house no longer carried the same hollow quiet. There was a rhythm to the morning. The soft thump of footsteps, the creak of the pump handle outside, the faint clink of tin against tin. Sounds that didn't belong to ghosts. When he stepped into the main room, Celeste was already there. She had rolled up her sleeves, her hair tied back with a strip of linen, and she was wiping down the table with deliberate, steady motions. A pot of water steamed near the stove. "Morning," she said, without looking up. Elias nodded. "You're up early." "Habit," she replied. "Mornings are when the world still listens." He didn't know what to make of that, so he busied himself with the stove. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, only unfamiliar, like stepping into a church after years away. When he reached for a mug, his hand brushed hers by accident. Her fingers were calloused, but warm. He muttered an apology and turned aside, pouring coffee with too much focus. She smiled faintly and went on cleaning, the soft scrape of cloth on wood filling the space between them. Later that day, while Elias was fixing a loose hinge on the barn door, he heard a sound that froze him mid-motion. A note, thin but clear, drifting from inside the house. The piano. He dropped the hammer and strode toward the porch, dust rising around his boots. Inside, Celeste sat at the piano bench, her fingers moving carefully across the keys. The lid had been pulled open, the cracked frame dusted clean. She pressed one key, then another, testing their voices. Most were dead, but a few trembled alive under her touch. Elias stopped in the doorway. "I thought I told you that things finished." Celeste didn't turn. "You said it was broken. That's not the same thing." Her fingers pressed another key. An E flat. The note came out cracked, like bone under strain. She frowned, lifted the front panel, and peered inside. "The hammer's split, but it can be mended." He crossed his arms. "Waste of time. That piano died 3 years ago." "Maybe," she said quietly. "But death and silence aren't the same." The words landed heavier than he expected. He watched as she worked, a small file in hand, adjusting strings with a care that felt more like prayer than labor. The light from the window fell across her shoulders, turning the air to gold dust. Elias realized he hadn't seen sunlight look that gentle in a long time. After a while, she spoke again, her eyes still on the keys. "Did your wife play?" He hesitated. "She tried. Mostly it was my boy. He'd bang on the thing until the walls shook." Celeste smiled, and for a moment her face softened into something tender. "That's a good sound to remember." Elias looked away. "Not when it ends in fire." The words slipped out sharper than he intended. The room tightened. Celeste's hands paused mid-air. She closed the lid of the piano, letting it fall with a soft thud. "I didn't mean to pry," she said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "No, I just don't talk about it." "Then don't," she said simply, standing. "Let the house do it for you." That night, the wind picked up again, sweeping through the cracks in the boards. Elias sat by the table, reading a letter he didn't understand anymore. An old bill, an order form, some leftover piece of business that meant nothing now. Celeste sat near the lamp, restringing a tuning hammer. The quiet between them felt alive, shaped by the sound of tools and breath. When she finished, she set the hammer down and asked, "Do you ever ride past the ridge?" "Not since the fire," he answered. "There's a creek there," she said. "It still runs. I saw it from the train window before the light faded." He stared at her. "You remember something you saw in the dark?" "I remember things that shine," she said, "even when the world pretends they don't." For a long time, he said nothing. Then he rose, walked to the piano, and lifted the lid again. His fingers hovered above the keys. One was missing entirely. Another hung loose, chipped at the edge. "Which one was it?" she asked softly. Middle C, he murmured. The one my boy always hit first. Celeste stepped closer, her presence quiet, warm like the air before rain. Then let's start there. He hesitated. What for? To give the house back its voice. She handed him a small wooden wedge and showed him where to place it. Their hands met briefly, his rough, hers sure. Together they adjusted the string until it hummed, faint but pure. Elias drew back, unsettled by the sound. Celeste smiled. There, see? Still remembers how to sing. He wanted to tell her that some songs weren't meant to be heard again, that the sound hurt more than the silence, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, he sat down, elbows on knees, watching her continue the repair. By the time the lamp burned low, a fragile melody floated through the room. Not a full tune, not even a scale, just fragments, hesitant, searching. Yet each note settled deeper than any he'd heard in years. When she stopped, Celeste looked over her shoulder. That's enough for tonight. Elias nodded. You'll spoil the quiet. She smiled. Sometimes quiet needs spoiling. He wanted to argue, but the warmth in her eyes silenced him. She left the lamp on, the soft gold spilling across the floorboards as she disappeared down the hall. Elias stayed where he was, the faint hum of the repaired string echoing in the stillness. He reached forward, pressed the key again. The sound lingered, vibrating through his chest until it faded into the night. For the first time since the fire, he didn't dread sleep. The air inside the house felt lighter somehow, as if something old had been forgiven. Outside, the desert wind carried a single, uneven note out into the dark, proof that broken things could still make music if someone believed they could. The following week unrolled in quiet rhythm. Celeste worked with the patience of someone who had spent years fixing what others had thrown away. She mended a broken shutter, polished the old lamp glass until it caught the light like honey, and spent hours each evening cleaning the rusted strings inside the piano. Elias found himself watching her more than he cared to admit. From the porch, from the barn, from the doorway where the light fell over her shoulders. The days carried a strange peace, too fragile, perhaps, to last. It was late afternoon when he saw the rider. A single horse kicking up dust from the south road, sun flashing off a brass buckle. Something in the way the man rode, upright, easy, as if the land itself bowed for him, made Elias step forward, unease prickling under his skin. The rider slowed by the gate and called out, his voice smooth and practiced. "Afternoon, mister. You Elias Turner?" Elias nodded, one hand resting on the fence rail. "Depends who's asking." The stranger smiled, showing perfect teeth gone yellow with tobacco. "Name's Raleigh. I'm looking for a woman. Celeste Ward. Said she might have come this way." Before Elias could answer, the front door opened. Celeste stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a rag. The moment her eyes found the man, the color drained from her face. She froze, and the rag slipped from her fingers into the dust. Raleigh tipped his hat. "Well, ain't this Providence? Been a long road, darlin'." Elias looked from one to the other. "You know him?" Celeste's voice came low and steady, but her hands trembled. "He knows me, but not in the way he thinks." Raleigh dismounted with the grace of a man who'd done so 1,000 times. "You owe me more than words, girl. You walked off from your obligation." Elias stepped forward, his shadow cutting between them. "Whatever business you've got, take it to town." Raleigh's gaze flicked to him, amused. It's simple, Cowboy. Her daddy took my money, promised her work until the debt was settled. She ran before the year was through. Law calls that theft. Celeste's chin lifted. Law calls a lot of things theft when it's a woman's freedom. The air thickened. A crow shrieked somewhere near the creek, its cry slicing the silence. Elias felt the weight of her words settle in him like a stone. He'd seen enough of men like Raleigh. Polished boots, soft hands, the kind who made rules for others to bleed under. She's under my roof now, Elias said quietly. Raleigh spat into the dirt. Roof don't change ownership. Celeste's jaw clenched. You can't own me. He smiled, tilting his hat. Sweetheart, that paper in my pocket says otherwise. Elias's hand drifted toward his belt, not quite touching the revolver but close enough for the message to land. You'll show that paper somewhere else. You're not welcome here. Raleigh's eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the dry hiss of wind through the mesquite. Then he laughed, swung himself back into the saddle, and said, I'll be back. Sun sets the same for all of us, mister. Don't think it won't rise for me again. He turned his horse and rode off, dust curling behind him like smoke. Celeste stayed on the porch long after he was gone. Elias stepped closer, the boards creaking under his boots. What did he mean? About a paper? Her eyes were on the horizon. My father lost everything to him. Cards, whiskey, pride. When the debt came due, I was what he had left to give. A signature made me property. Elias swallowed hard. You ran. I walked, she said, and every mile I took I thought I was free. The wind caught her hair, pulling loose strands across her face. He wanted to say something. Anything. But there were no words that could mend what men like Raleigh had written into her life. That night, she worked late on the piano, the lamp burning low beside her. Elias sat on the porch, sharpening a blade he didn't need, listening to the faint rhythm of her tools tapping against the wood. Every sound was a small defiance, a declaration that she would not bow to the man who had tried to cage her. When the lamp finally went dark, Elias walked inside. Celeste stood by the piano, hands still. He'll come again, she said quietly. I know. You don't owe me this fight. I don't owe him either. For a moment, they faced each other in silence. The distance between them seemed smaller than it had before, filled not with fear, but recognition. Two people carrying the weight of promises broken by others. Thank you, she said. Elias looked away. Don't thank me yet. Outside, lightning flashed far off beyond the ridge. No thunder came, only a distant glow against the clouds. The air smelled of iron and dust, the scent before a storm. Celeste turned to the piano and pressed one key, the repaired one from nights ago. The note rang pure, unbroken. If he returns, she said, I want him to hear this first. Elias nodded. He'll hear it. He stepped to the window, watching the horizon darken. Something inside him stirred. Not rage, not fear, but resolve. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt like a line drawn in the dirt, a place worth standing for. Before he went to bed, he checked the rifle by the door. His hand brushed the barrel, then dropped away. He didn't want to use it. He just wanted the choice to mean something. When dawn came, the horizon was pale and cold. Celeste brewed coffee in silence, The bruise of worry under her eyes had deepened, but her shoulders stayed straight. Elias joined her at the table. "If he rides this way again," he said, "we'll be ready." She met his gaze. "Ready for what?" "To stay standing." A flicker of a smile touched her lips, faint as the morning light. "Then we'd best make the house stronger." The wind rose outside, lifting the curtain like a hand waving from another world. Elias took one last look at her before heading for the barn. The sound of hammering followed him into the day, a rhythm that was neither surrender nor warning, just two people building something that might, if they were lucky, last through the coming storm. The day Raleigh returned, the sky was already the color of rust. A strange stillness hung over Dusthaven, heavy as held breath. Even the horses sensed it, ears twitching, hooves shifting restlessly inside the corral. Elias had been working on the fence line since dawn, sweat darkening his shirt, when he felt it first. That distant tremor in the air, the slow pulse of wind rising from the south. He turned toward the house, saw Celeste on the porch, sleeves rolled, her hair tied high, a bucket at her feet. She was scrubbing the last of the soot from the piano lid, her movements patient, unhurried. Elias opened his mouth to call out, but the wind answered first. A sudden gust tore across the yard, carrying sand sharp enough to sting. Within minutes, the horizon vanished in a wall of amber dust. The sky folded into itself, swallowing, the sun whole. Elias cursed under his breath and ran for the porch. "Storm's coming!" he shouted. Celeste didn't flinch. She stood watching the swirling edge of the storm as though reading something written in its chaos. "It's early," she said quietly. "Too early for wind like this." "Get inside," Elias ordered. "Latch the windows tight. I'll bring the horses in." She nodded and turned toward the door, but before either of them could move, another sound rose from beneath the roar of the wind, the steady, deliberate rhythm of hooves. Elias froze. Out of the curtain of dust, 3 riders emerged. The first wore a long duster coat and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Raleigh. He reined in hard near the fence, shouting over the wind, "Told you I'd be back." Celeste stepped closer to the porch post, her hand gripping the wood. Elias moved in front of her. The sand lashed against them, slicing the air like tiny blades. "You picked a bad day for visiting," Elias said, voice low. Raleigh laughed, loud enough to drown in the storm. "Figured the weather might keep good folks indoors. Didn't think you'd hide behind a door, Turner." "I'm not hiding." "Good," Raleigh sneered. "Makes it easier." He turned to his men. "Take her." Before they could move, the wind howled so fiercely the horses reared, whinnying in panic. Sand swirled like fire around them. Elias grabbed Celeste's hand. "Go!" They ran for the barn, half blind, the air thick with grit. The storm swallowed everything, the sky, the fence, the line between courage and madness. Inside, the barn shuddered under the force of the wind. Dust seeped through every crack. Elias threw the bolt on the door, his chest heaving. Celeste coughed, wiping her face. "They'll come through the back." "Let them try." He grabbed a length of chain, looping it around the door handle. "Stay low." Outside, the sound of hooves thudded closer, muffled by the gale. A shadow passed across the small window, then another. Raleigh's voice came faintly. "You can't keep her, Turner. That paper's worth more than both of you put together." Elias raised his rifle, pointing it toward the light slanting through the cracks. "You step through that door," he said, "and the wind won't be the only thing that cuts you." There was a pause, then laughter, carried off by the storm. A moment later, the sound of retreating hooves. Elias didn't trust it. He stood there, finger tight on the trigger, until Celeste touched his arm. "He's gone," she said. "For now." The barn roof groaned, timbers bending under the strain. Through the slats above, the world glowed orange. Dust filled the air, coating everything in a thin layer of earth. Celeste sank down beside a haystack, drawing her knees up. "I used to think storms were punishment," she murmured. "Back east, the wind never came like this. It stayed polite. Predictable." Elias lowered the rifle, kneeling beside her. "Out here, wind's honest. It takes what it wants." She looked at him, eyes glinting in the dim light. "And what do you want, Mr. Turner?" He opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. The truth was too close, too raw. Instead, he said, "To keep you safe." Celeste's lips curved, not in a smile, but something deeper. "Safe isn't the same as free." The boards rattled again, cutting off his reply. A beam above them cracked, sending down a rain of dust. He caught her shoulder and pulled her aside just as part of the roof gave way. They stumbled together into the shadows, landing hard against a stack of old tack and tools. For a breathless moment, neither spoke. Then she laughed, soft, breathless, disbelieving. "You're bleeding." He looked down. A thin line of red ran across his forearm where a nail had grazed him. "It's nothing." "Everything that hurts starts as nothing," she said, reaching for a scrap of cloth. She tore it, bound his arm with quick, sure hands. Her fingers brushed his skin, rough meeting tender, heat meeting tremor. When she finished, he didn't pull away. The storm roared louder outside, shaking the walls. Somewhere in that chaos, something fragile had formed. An understanding. Unspoken, but alive. Elias exhaled. "You ever think of leaving this place?" She looked up. "Every day. But then I think, if I keep running, there won't be a place left to stand." He nodded slowly. "Then we stand." For a long while, they listened to the storm. The sound became a pulse, wild and steady. Celeste leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. Elias watched her, the way the lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the small streak of dust along her neck. He realized then that the storm outside wasn't the only one breaking him open. By nightfall, the wind began to fade. The silence that followed was immense, heavy with exhaustion. Elias pushed the door open a crack. The air beyond was still thick with dust, but the sky had cleared just enough to show a slice of moon. They stepped out together. The ranch was unrecognizable, fences buried, the porch half collapsed, the land flattened into a dull expanse of red. Yet the horses had survived, huddled near the fence line. Life clung on. Celeste stood beside him, hair wild, clothes streaked with grit. She looked like something carved out of the land itself, tough, beautiful, unyielding. Elias turned to her. "He'll be back." "I know. But so will we." For a heartbeat, their eyes held, and the world felt still again. Then Celeste reached up, touched the edge of his bandaged arm, and said, "You saved me." He shook his head. "You fixed me first." They didn't speak after that. They just stood, side by side, as the wind carried the last grains of dust into the dark. Above them, the first faint stars appeared, sharp as nails, piercing through what remained of the storm. By morning, the storm had moved east, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt holy. The air was heavy with dust, the light the color of tarnished brass. Elias woke before the sun, the taste of grit still on his tongue. The barn smelled of hay and rain that never quite fell. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the damp crust of earth, and looked toward the horizon. What he saw made him stop. The sky was gathering again, but this time not with dust. Dark clouds stretched low and swollen, trembling with the promise of water. Real rain, the kind Dusthaven hadn't seen in months. He turned back toward the house. Celeste was already awake, standing by the porch with her arms folded, her hair loose and tangled from the night before. She looked smaller somehow, framed by the wounded shape of the ranch, yet her eyes were calm. "It's coming," he said. "I can smell it," she replied. "The earth's been waiting." They stood there together as the first drops began to fall. Soft, tentative, the way someone touches a scar they're afraid to reopen. Then, within minutes, the sky gave way, pouring its weight across the land. Elias removed his hat, letting the rain wash through his hair, down his face. Celeste tilted her head back, eyes closed, lips parted in a quiet smile. It wasn't joy, exactly, but something older. Recognition. When the downpour softened to a steady rhythm, she turned to him. "The piano's ready," she said. He frowned. "After last night?" "It survived worse." Inside, the house felt transformed. The air smelled of wet wood and new beginnings. Celeste lit the lamp near the piano, though the gray light spilling through the windows was enough. The instrument stood clean, its surface wiped of soot, its frame mended. A few keys were still chipped, but she had coaxed sound back into most of them. Elias hovered by the doorway, unsure. He hadn't heard music in that room since the fire. It felt wrong and right all at once. Celeste brushed her fingers across the keys. "You don't have to listen," she murmured. He stayed. The first notes were hesitant, wandering like the rain itself. Then they found their footing, a slow, haunting melody that moved through the room in long, aching strokes. Elias closed his eyes. The sound was not perfect. Some notes rang hollow, others too sharp. But beneath the flaws was something raw, alive. The piano didn't sound like what it had been. It sounded like what it had become. He found himself breathing in time with the rhythm, every note dissolving the noise inside his chest. The rain hit the roof in counterpoint, steady and sure. When Celeste shifted to the lower keys, the house seemed to lean closer, as if listening too. Without meaning to, he moved toward her. She felt his presence before she saw him. "What do you hear?" she asked softly, not turning around. "My life," he said, "and something that might come after it." Celeste smiled faintly, still playing. "Then you're listening right." Her hands slowed, hovering above the final chord. She let it fade into silence. The rain kept falling, but the room felt suspended, held in that quiet between endings and beginnings. Elias reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The touch was nothing more than a question, but she answered without words. Just tilted her head slightly, letting her temple brush his knuckles. For a moment, they stayed that way. The only sound was the rain tracing lines down the windows and the faint hum of the world remembering how to breathe. Celeste rose then, turning toward him. "You kept your promise," she said. "What promise?" "To stand." He looked at her, searching her face for the anger or fear he expected to find. But there was only peace, worn and earned. "I didn't think it would feel like this," he said. "Like what?" "Like losing something again. But this time, it doesn't hurt." Celeste's eyes softened. "That's because it's not loss, it's letting go." She stepped away from the piano, walking to the open door. Outside, the rain had turned the dirt road into a ribbon of red clay. The horizon shimmered with silver mist. Elias followed her, standing in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "I used to play in church," she said quietly. "Back then I thought music was meant to please someone, God, a crowd, anyone listening. But now I know it's enough if it just reaches one soul that's forgotten how to listen." Elias swallowed. "You reached mine." She didn't answer. Instead, she walked out into the rain. Her dress clung to her legs, her feet sinking slightly into the mud. She looked like part of the land, rooted and restless all at once. Elias watched her, then stepped down from the porch, boots splashing. The rain chilled him, soaked through his shirt, but he didn't care. Celeste turned to face him, rain streaking down her face, and laughed softly. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Standing," he said. Her laughter faded, replaced by something quieter. She reached out, took his hand, and pressed it to her heart. Beneath the rain and thunder, he felt it. Strong, steady, alive. The sound of the storm swelled around them, the sky cracking open with light. Celeste lifted her face, her eyes bright even in the gray. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "What?" "The world forgiving itself." Elias didn't know if she meant the rain or the music or something neither of them could name. But standing there, the dust washing away, the piano still echoing faintly from the house behind them, he knew the land was no longer empty. They walked back inside together, water pooling under their boots. Celeste set her tools on the table, her hands trembling slightly. Elias picked up the kettle, poured 2 cups of coffee, and handed one to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. "You never said thank you," she teased. "For what? For staying?" He smiled. "I thought that was your line." Her gaze lingered on him, soft and unreadable. "Maybe it belongs to both of us." The rain began to ease, leaving only the whisper of drops sliding from the eaves. Celeste sat once more at the piano and pressed a single key. Its note rang clear through the quiet house, strong, certain, whole. Elias stood behind her, watching the steam rise from their cups. "What will you play next?" he asked. "Something we haven't heard yet," she said. Outside, the first thin beam of sunlight pierced the clouds, cutting across the wet plains. Inside, the last notes of her melody drifted upward like smoke, carrying with them all the unspoken things that words could never reach. Morning light came slow, washing the land in silver before warming to gold. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving puddles that caught the sky like small mirrors. For the first time in months, the air in Dust Haven smelled clean. You could taste life in it. Wet soil, grass daring to rise again, the faint sweetness of wild sage bruised by the wind. Elias rose early, though sleep had only brushed him. He moved through the house barefoot, quiet as a man afraid to wake something sacred. Celeste was still asleep on the chair beside the piano, her head resting on her folded arms. The lamplight had gone out, but the gray morning painted her face in soft hues, peaceful, tired, utterly human. He hesitated, then covered her shoulders with a blanket. For a long moment he stood there, listening to her slow, even breathing. It felt like the first sound of belonging he'd ever known. He made coffee. The kettle hissed on the stove, filling the small kitchen with steam. It was an ordinary act, but the kind that stitched a morning into permanence. He poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for her, and placed them side by side on the worn wooden table. When Celeste stirred awake, the room was bathed in sunlight. She blinked, the faintest smile touching her lips as her eyes fell on the cups. 2? Elias nodded. You fixed the house. Seemed only fair to make it feel like 1. She rose, stretching the stiffness from her shoulders, and joined him. Her hair was wild, her dress wrinkled, but she looked like the day itself, unpolished, unafraid. She took a sip, grimaced. You don't use sugar? I ran out last winter. Then it's honest coffee. She smiled, and he found himself laughing, surprised by the sound. The moment hung between them, light as dust in sunlight. For once, neither reached for words to fill the space. It was enough to sit there, the warmth of the mugs seeping into their palms, the quiet hum of a world slowly remembering how to live. Outside, the horses wandered near the fence, their coats dark from rain. The fields shimmered with shallow water, each puddle reflecting the sky. Celeste set her cup down and walked to the window. They came back, she said softly. They always do. She turned toward him. Even after you let them go? Elias nodded. If they trust you, they find their way home. Celeste looked down at her hands. I never had a place like that. Not until now. The simplicity of her words caught him off guard. He wanted to say something back, but all he managed was, You built it yourself. She shook her head. We did. He studied her profile against the light. The edges of her face seemed carved from the same sunlight spilling through the window. Strong, quiet, and certain. In that stillness, he understood something that had been circling him for days. Love wasn't always ablaze. Sometimes it was a steady flame that refused to die, even when there was no one left to tend it. Celeste turned, resting a hand on the table. You know, you never told me what you'll do if Raleigh returns. Elias's jaw tightened. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter, she said. Maybe what's left of him can't reach what we've already claimed. He met her eyes. And what's that? Her voice came soft but firm. The right to stay. A long silence followed. The clock on the wall ticked faintly, its rhythm folding into the quiet. Elias nodded once, as if sealing a vow neither of them needed to speak aloud. Later, when the sun climbed high, they stepped outside to tend to the land. The soil was soft, easy underfoot. Celeste knelt, pressing her fingers into it, the moisture clinging to her skin. Still good, she murmured. Still forgiving. Elias stood nearby, leaning on his shovel. You can tell that just by touching it? She smiled without looking up. You learn to listen. The ground always tells the truth. He thought about that for a while, then started to dig, turning the soil beside her. The air filled with the scent of earth, sharp and alive. Hours passed unnoticed. When the work was done, they sat on the porch steps, muddy and exhausted. Elias handed her a canteen. She took a sip, passed it back. "It feels strange," she said. "What does?" "Peace," he chuckled. "You'll get used to it." "I don't want to," she said. "I want to keep noticing it." The wind rose gently, carrying the faint creak of the barn door. A hawk circled overhead, its cry distant but clear. Elias looked out over the land, flattened fences, half-ruined roof, and beyond it, endless space. It wasn't perfect, but it was his again. The world had edges now, and inside them, someone who chose to stay. When evening came, he lit the lantern. Celeste sat by the window, humming softly while stitching the tear in his shirt sleeve. The flame caught the strands of her hair, turning them to bronze. Elias poured 2 fresh cups of coffee and set one beside her. She glanced at it, then at him. "You're learning?" "I had a good teacher." She smiled, finished the last stitch, and placed the shirt neatly on the chair. "It's almost whole again," she said. "Almost is good enough," he replied. Outside, the sky deepened to violet. The rain had washed the world clean, but the earth still steamed with heat from the day. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice stretching thin across the valley. Celeste stood, walked to the piano, and touched the keys. A faint note trembled in the air, sweet and imperfect. She looked over her shoulder at Elias. "Do you think it'll last?" "What?" "This peace." He thought for a long while. "Maybe not, but that doesn't make it less real." She nodded. "Then we'll play until it fades." She pressed another key, softer this time. The sound hung in the dim room like a prayer. Elias raised his cup, drinking slow, eyes never leaving her. 2 cups sat on the table, side by side, steam rising and mingling into one invisible thread. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. The house itself seemed to breathe now, filled with the sound of living, gentle, imperfect, alive. The wind shifted again in the days that followed. No longer cruel, but full of scent. Grass pushing through the wet soil, wood smoke from a far ranch, and something faintly sweet, like the promise of spring still hidden in the earth. Elias felt it each morning when he stepped outside, the sense that the land itself had exhaled after a long punishment. He had repaired the porch rail and patched the barn roof with boards salvaged from the fence. Celeste had sewn curtains for the windows, pale linen that fluttered with the afternoon light. The house no longer looked abandoned. It breathed with them, moved with them. But peace never lasts forever on the frontier. One evening, as the sun bled across the ridgeline, Elias spotted a dark speck moving along the horizon. A rider coming slow, careful, with purpose. His chest tightened. Raleigh. He watched until the figure disappeared behind the far ridge, then turned to Celeste, who stood by the piano, wiping the dust from its lid. She looked at him and understood before he spoke. "It's time?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "But we're not running." She nodded once, no fear in her face. "Then we stay." The next day passed under a low gray sky. Elias spent it in the barn, checking the rifle, tightening the door latch, preparing not for a fight but for certainty. When he came back inside, Celeste was sitting at the piano bench, humming quietly. On the table beside her lay a folded letter, the paper worn at the edges. "What's that?" he asked. "My father's last letter," she said. "The one I never opened." He hesitated. "You could burn it." "I could," she said, tracing her thumb along the fold. "But if I do, I'll never know whether it was apology or excuse." Elias said nothing. The lamplight flickered, casting soft gold across her face. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Will you stay if he rides in?" "I'll stand where I always do." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll play." By dusk, the sky darkened to violet. The air was still. Too still. Elias sat by the window, watching the horizon turn to shadow. Celeste lit the lamp, its glow warming the room. Then she opened the piano lid and began to play. Not to soothe, not to prove, but to remember. The melody rose simple and low, the kind of tune you might hum on a long ride home. It wound through the house like a thread, binding walls, memories, breath. Elias listened, the rifle resting against his knee, the music filling the silence between heartbeats. Outside, hooves struck the dirt. Slow, deliberate. Celeste didn't stop playing. The sound of the horse came closer until it halted just beyond the porch. Elias stood. His pulse matched the rhythm of her song. Steady, deliberate, unflinching. A knock followed. 3 times. Then Raleigh's voice, slick and composed. "Evening, Turner. I've come for what's mine." Elias opened the door just wide enough to meet his eyes. The man's coat was clean, his smile practiced, but there was something tired in it now. Dust clung to his boots. "She's not yours," Elias said. "Paper says otherwise." "Paper burns." Raleigh tilted his head, as if measuring the conviction in those words. Behind Elias, the music continued. Soft, defiant. It drifted through the open door, wrapping around them both. Raleigh's expression faltered. "She still plays?" "She lives," Elias said. "That's more than you'll ever own." For a long moment, Raleigh said nothing. Then he looked past Elias toward Celeste. "You've got fire, I'll give you that. But fire dies when the wind changes." Celeste lifted her gaze from the keys. "Not if it learns to burn quiet." The man's smirk slipped, replaced by something unreadable. He tipped his hat. "You keep your flame, then. I've no use for ashes." He turned his horse and rode off, disappearing into the violet dusk. The echo of his departure faded until only the piano remained. Elias closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Celeste's hands never faltered. She played until the last trace of Raleigh was gone, until the world outside their walls belonged to them again. When she finally stopped, Elias crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench. Neither spoke. The last note lingered between them, trembling faintly before falling into stillness. "You didn't have to stand between us," she said at last. He looked at her. "I wasn't between, I was beside." Celeste's lips curved, a small, true smile. "Then beside is where we stay." Outside, the first stars broke through the thinning clouds. The land shimmered under their faint silver light. Celeste rose, fetched the letter from the table, and held it over the lamp flame. The edges curled, darkened, and turned to ash. Elias watched the smoke rise, soft and blue. "You sure?" She nodded. "It was written by a man who never listened. I don't need his words to know I'm free." When the letter was gone, she returned to the bench, placed her fingers on the keys, and pressed one. Middle C, the note they had fixed together. It rang clean, unwavering. Elias reached out, laying his rough hand over hers. "Play it again." She did. Outside, the wind shifted once more, gentle this time, carrying the scent of wet grass and smoke from the dying fire. The sound of the piano blended with the hush of the land until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. As the last note faded, Elias whispered, "You hear that?" Celeste leaned against him, her voice barely a breath. "It's the world starting over." He closed his eyes, the warmth of her against him, the weight of the moment anchoring him to the earth. The scars, the silence, the long years of dust. They had led here, to this room, to this single note that would not break. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly with dawn, and inside, two hearts, once strangers, once survivors, kept time with a melody that asked for nothing but to be heard. If this story stirred something quiet in you, tell me what part stayed the longest: the rain, the song, or the silence. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe if you want to keep walking these dusty roads with me. There are more stories waiting out here, about love that comes late, but never too late.